So I hope many of you haven't completely forgotten what I look like, but sorry for the 2 month delay in content. Certainly did not anticipate that it would take that long or I would be away for that long, and I apologize for that. I have a bunch of reviews I want to get out for you guys, and I want to get that out in a somewhat steady fashion, so please be patient with me as content starts to flow back to the channel. Unfortunately, for my first review here and my first video back in a couple of months, it's not going to be a very positive one. We're going to be talking about a game here that, honestly, for me, is probably the worst game I played this year, bearing in mind that I've actually skipped on Gollum, the Gollum game that came out in May, which by all accounts was broken beyond repair. This game, however, is polished. It's actually functional, and it runs really well. It's well optimized. It just isn't very good creatively. There's a lot of issues here. I'm talking about Atlas Fallen. This is the brand new IP from Deck 13, which is why I honestly was interested in the game and why I purchased it. If you don't know who Deck 13 is, Deck 13 were the developers behind the original Lords of the Fallen game, which is getting a reboot and re-release in actually just a couple of months by a completely different studio. I actually thought Deck 13 was making the reboot, but they're not. It's a different studio who's actually helming that project. But they also brought us the excellent The Surge games, which I thought really improved on the initial foundation that they kind of built with Lords of the Fallen. Much better games, very well playing games, and brought a cool sci-fi aesthetic to this sort of Soulsborne type gameplay genre. And I very much enjoyed that game, both the original game and its sequel that followed soon after. I played both of them and had a great time with those games. So needless to say, I was really hoping that Atlas Fallen was going to be a very solid title at the very least something different for a studio that was trying to branch off into a different type of style game. You know, this isn't a Soulsborne game. It's not a game about difficulty, you know, or really grinding and leveling up your character or anything like that. This is more helmed as a action adventure RPG. It's not really a heavy RPG, I would say. It's very light on the RPG mechanics, and you can't really do anything in terms of flexibility with the gameplay. But it is more of an action-adventure game. You're going to be kind of drifting across these large desert sand dunes and going into these different towns, talking with people, doing side missions, and just kind of, you know, killing a bunch of, sand monsters and different weird, kind of fantasy creatures and whatnot. So that's basically the bulk of your time while you're following through with this story. I unfortunately found that this game has major issues with just about everything, every aspect of its creative design. Again, this is a very polished game, and it does deserve some commendation, because a lot of games are coming out now. They're super buggy. They're really just alpha builds of the game. You have to wait at least like 6 months for the games to be in a somewhat playable state. I'm still waiting to play Star Wars Jedi Survivor for that very reason. That game is still sitting there on my shelf in the cellophane. It's completely wrapped. I haven't installed it. I haven't done anything because I want a patch to drop that's going to completely resolve all of the frame rate issues, performance issues, the bugs with the game. And we're sitting here, at this point, what is it, like 4 or 5 months since the release of that game, and we're still waiting for a performance patch to really help improve the frame rate of that game. It doesn't even matter if you play it in its quality mode or its frame rate performance mode. You're going to get frame rate dips either way. I can say at least with Atlas Fallen, it does have your quality and performance modes. I played it on the performance mode for this type of style of the game. All the marketing was done in that mode anyway. And you're not really sacrificing anything in the way of visual fidelity. It just lowers the resolution very slightly and achieves a basically perfectly locked 60 FPS. Didn't notice any major frame rate issues with this game, and I did try playing it in 30. It's a much more jittery experience, and I would not recommend it for how fast-paced this game does play, but you can play it at a steady 30 FPS. It's frame-paced properly, and there's no issues with performance with Atlas Fallen. So at the very least, I can say with this game that my experience throughout my entire playthrough, I didn't run into any crashes. There were a handful of bugs, but nothing like too major. Nothing that, halted my progress with the game or, anything like that. It was weird visual glitches and errors, and they didn't really occur very frequently. It was only during set parts, and I uploaded a couple videos on Twitter that I thought were funny.
Wow. Oh. Oh. Oh, no.
Just because there's a lot of weird technical quirks with this game. Again, it's not anything in the way of it being, unpolished or anything like that. I think it's just the fact that their engine that they're using is inherently a last generation engine. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this is using a modified version of the Surge engine that they used, which was a custom engine for them at the time. I wouldn't be surprised if it's using sort of that engine, but slightly modified in a way that allows them to build the game, the type of game that they wanted to do here with Atlas Fallen. So I have to say right up the bat that it is polished in terms of you being able to play the game, but technically speaking, yes, there are some visual bugs. Graphically, this game is a terrible, terrible showcase for a current gen only game. You can actually not get this game on PS4 or Xbox One. And when you first boot the game, you're going to be shocked as to why it isn't available on those platforms, because it feels like a game that's inherently cross generation. Textures are very poor, very blurry, and they actually take a long time to load into the game world. So there are a lot of instances when I was playing this game and you're moving through the world at a somewhat quick pace, but you would expect that playing this, especially on PS5 with the SSD and how fast that drive is, that it would have no issue pulling in textures for the memory and the different objects around the world. I found that this game, there was a lot of texture popping in this game, just kind of moving around and generally going into, areas, not even in a somewhat quick pace, but just sort of at your normal, running pace gameplay, your normal exploration gameplay.
Those are the fucking textures? Those are the fucking textures on PS5. Are you fucking... The hell is this game?
Textures would pop in, and it's funny to me because the textures that would pop in, right, the actual loaded real assets for the game are not even that high resolution anyway. You can actually see the pixel breakup of some of these objects, and especially like the rocks and different terrain in the game. It looks quite poor. I'm very, very disappointed with this game, especially because its build, although it is a AA project at its core, right? They are selling this. I guess we can call this a budget game because it's being sold at $60 instead of the $70 price tag, which to me is just, not all games have adopted that new price. But for this game in particular, you're paying $60. It's a current gen only game. You would expect them to utilize some type of technical features that would be indicative of it being a current generation game, but it doesn't have any ray tracing. It doesn't have any special real-time global illumination. It's not Unreal Engine 5. It's nothing like that. There's nothing here that makes it feel like it's a current gen only title, and yet it looks like a game that was inherently born on like an early last generation game, like an early PS4 or Xbox One game. That's kind of how this game looks. Character models are very poor, very poorly animated as well. Again, texture detail and just the way their faces look. You can customize your character, but there's almost no point because you get armor and the armor blocks his face. They do actually take off your helmet during conversations, but your character design doesn't really come into the play of the story in any meaningful way whatsoever. So you can customize your character, you can make him anywhere from being hideous to somewhat acceptable, but because the character models are so poorly rendered, you're going to be having a tough time actually getting the people to look the way that you want. And the graphics don't help either, because as you get into the game, it just immediately makes a bad first impression. I guess part of the reason why the game runs so well is because it's not really pushing anything in the way of visuals. You do have some cool particle effects, I guess. Keep in mind that one of the main gameplay pillars of Atlas Fallen is that you can actually drift across the sand dunes. So there's actually, the world is kind of comprised of different towns over the landscape of these vast dunes, and your character uses his ability to kind of literally drift across the sand, and it's basically your way of traversal. It doesn't really service anything in the way of gameplay. It's just a quicker way of getting around. However, it's kind of the signature style for this game, but it didn't really do anything for me. It just, again, it's just a kind of interesting way to get from point A to point B, but it doesn't actually mean anything in terms of the gameplay. You can't do any sort of crazy stuff drifting around. You're just moving at a kind of quicker pace, and there's nothing that your character can really do specifically with that ability other than just navigate the world. So you get some nice particle effects because the sand kind of, kicks up and whatnot, but it doesn't leave like trails or, like wakes of sand in the distance. It doesn't do anything like that. So the world doesn't even feel that reactive to what you're doing in the game. You can leave footprints, but these footprints disappear, and I've seen better deformation with snow and sand in last generation games than I've seen here. It just seems like, this game was kind of all over the place. I don't even know if this game was in development for a very long time. I kind of get the impression that this was a much smaller project from the studio, that they had someone who maybe had like a passion. They wanted to create a game like this. They wanted to kind of branch off and do their own thing, and so they took a much smaller portion of the studio to work on this game specifically, while Deck 13 works on whatever the hell they're working on, whether it's another Surge game or another new IP. This just isn't it, though, Atlas Fallen. Now, at the end of all this, kind of holding it together, is the game's narrative. Unfortunately, this just doesn't go anywhere either. You're kind of dropped into this world. It kind of gets very lore-heavy. The cutscenes are told in this kind of, 2D image, kind of drawings in a more kind of pre-mordial type of style. So it's got this weird kind of flair with its story, and it starts referencing things in its material that you have no idea, what it even means. And so it gets very convoluted as you progress through it. Bottom line is that there's some like evil force that's like taking control of people, and it's like a battle against the gods, and you have the power of this other god who's trying to fight the evil god and save humanity. It's very convoluted, very kind of disinteresting, and there's so much material here that you're just kind of like, the game's talking and referencing different elements in history that happened within its story, and you have no frame of reference or understanding for what any of it means. I just kind of ignored the story, to be completely honest. I was watching the cutscenes unfold, but I wasn't emotionally invested. I didn't really care much what was going on. And quite honestly, within the first 3 to 4 hours of me playing this game, I was waiting for it to end. I was like ready. I was like, okay, this isn't interesting to me whatsoever. The best thing I can say about Atlas Fallen is that it only took me 15 hours to complete this game from start to finish, and that was with doing side missions and actually going out of my way to make sure that I put some time into the side missions. The side missions in this game are some of the most worthless, time-wasting objectives I ever played in a video game, at least recently. you will be doing things like talking to a store clerk who had his apples stolen from him, and you literally walk like 2 feet in one direction. You see an apple on the floor, and you follow the apples that leads you to the apple thief. And then the apple thief says, "Don't turn me in," and you have a choice to turn him in or not. It doesn't amount to anything. It doesn't mean anything to the story. You can completely ignore, what the apple thief wants or turn him in, and it doesn't mean anything. Like you don't get something special from the store clerk or the apple thief depending on the choice that you make. It means nothing, and that's just you. You think that's just one mission, but there's a lot of other missions where you'll meet these kind of weird characters that are kind of mysterious. They'll ask you to go do something, and then you'll never hear from them again. It's really bizarre. It feels to me almost like the game was built as a single player experience, almost a linear experience, and then they decided to make it open world, or at least have some free roaming elements, and then they had to pack it in with side content because, let's just check off a list of open world activities within our game. None of it really means anything. None of it really amounts to any sort of rewards when it comes to the gameplay, and quite frankly, none of it ever. It doesn't tell a compelling story with its side missions or even with its main narrative. So there's no reason to go out and do this. I guess you only get experience, which you can use that experience to further upgrade your abilities. But I didn't even like the abilities in this game. This game has a very weird upgrade system where you can choose different perks and abilities, and you only have a set number of slots to apply these perks and abilities to. And so you have to use these crafting resources, basically different things that you find throughout traversing the world, to basically craft certain upgrades and abilities, and then you can enable these abilities depending on the type of power that they are. Some of these abilities help me out in combat. Some of them help you out in terms of health and stuff like that. Others will help you out in terms of building up your special ability meter so you can do a more powerful attack. It kind of just depends. I really didn't care for the upgrades in this game. I was a bit confused on using some of those abilities, because the way this game works is that as you do consecutive attacks on enemies, you'll fill a meter, and the longer you are able to keep a combo up without getting hit, the higher that meter will go, and the higher that meter goes, the better of a special ability or whatever you have selected can be used. So that's the way it kind of works. And if you get hit, that meter gets, lower and lower and lower until it's just not filled anymore, and you kind of have to work your way up. So it encourages this kind of, combat where you have to kind of play very carefully. Unfortunately, I have to say that the combat system in this game is quite poor. And one of the worst combat, in fact, I would say that out of all the Deck 13 games I played, this has the worst combat system out of any of their games, I feel. Now, you get weapons throughout playing the game, and I think there's only 3 weapons throughout the entire game. So you can map these weapons to a specific button on the controller, and you can only have 2 weapons attached at one point, and then these basically act as your light and heavy attacks depending on the weapon that you have selected. This game kind of plays like a classic God of War. It's kind of like a hack and slash game, sort of like that. And again, depending on the weapon that you have selected, the gameplay might change just a bit, at least the pacing of it. But with only 3 weapons throughout the game, at least that I found throughout my entire experience, and again, I was going out of my way to do side missions too, so I wasn't trying to, if there was more weapons in the game, I would have definitely found them, but I just didn't. It doesn't really have a lot of variability in terms of how you approach combat. You can't play as like a ranged character. You can't play as like a brute force type character, or like a heavy hitter, or like someone who's very quick and fast paced but doesn't do a lot of damage. Like, there's no variability in terms of the way the game plays. Basically, enemies have a level, you have a level, and the enemies that are higher level will just simply have more health. They take a lot longer to actually kill than depending on what your level is. You might do less damage or more damage if their level is higher or lower than yours. So that's basically how this game works. And you're just kind of hacking away at these enemies, and it's not engaging, it's not fun, it's very tedious, especially because the camera is so poor in this game. I cannot tell you the amount of times that I grew increasingly frustrated just playing normal combat situations in this game, because enemies have weird attack patterns where they'll attack at different speeds. And you also have sort of this timed block mechanic where, if you can basically block an enemy, you can't hold the block button, but you can time sort of a parry move. And what it does is it freezes the enemies if you are able to parry them right before an attack. The problem is that sometimes you'll be facing an enemy and they'll be going to hit you like this at a very kind of slow pace, and other times they'll come up to you and just hit you very quickly. Like there's no pattern, or it's very difficult to see the set pattern that enemies have, because they attack at different paces, certain moves, and depending on how far they are from you, they may or may not do the same thing as before. I died a lot of times throughout this game, and I was using my special abilities. I can't really say that. I mean, I don't really think I was playing the game incorrectly, right? Because I'm looking at this, and every single combat situation that I was getting into was being very frustrating to me. I've reset my whole upgrade system. I've redone all the upgrades and abilities that I've wanted to do, so maybe I could play it in a very different way, or at least I could give myself an edge, like with health, because that's what I was really suffering with the most. But each combat situation played out the same, and honestly, it was just brute force alone that I was getting through this game. In fact, I would say an extra 4 hours of gameplay, probably an extra 4 to 5 hours of total gameplay in this game was spent just me redoing boss fights the entire time, and just trying to get through the game. Some of these boss fights took me over an hour, not because they were, increasingly difficult or, very hard to actually master, but just because enemies would attack you at weird timings, and, you wouldn't have enough time to block or react, and all of a sudden your health is gone. And I did not care for the combat in this game. I felt it was a big hindrance, and I just groaned at the idea of me having to actually play the game, actually engage with enemies and do combat, and actually just play like the video game part of it. It was the least enjoyable element for me. Honestly, there isn't really much fun to be had with this experience, which kind of depresses me, because Deck 13, I've been really, sort of championing them as of late, because, Lords of the Fallen was a technical mess of a game, but you could see where there was potential. And the Surge, when they brought the Surge out, it completely resolved all of the issues. It brought an interesting art direction, an interesting style, and an interesting gameplay style to the Soulsborne type genre. And the Surge 2, which I felt wasn't as good as the first game, was still a very respectable game. I actually finished it and enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to. And so I was really hoping that Atlas Fallen was just going to be another at least solid title from the studio. It didn't have to win any awards, but I did expect it to be competent and somewhat enjoyable. And there was just nothing here. I can't recommend it for the story. The visuals, it being a current gen only game, it's almost laughable, just how poor the game looks. They're not taking advantage of anything special. There's not even like reflections in the game. There's no SSR, like there's barely any ambient occlusion. The world looks barren and just so bad. Clearly I think something went really wrong with development with this game when they were actually making it. I'm not really sure. We don't really have the story on that as far as I'm aware, but clearly there were a lot of issues getting this game, kind of completed and out the door. At least that's how it kind of gives you the impression of. The music of this game isn't really that interesting to listen to. It doesn't really do anything for me. The sound of the game is okay, I guess. And like the side missions are worthless, and the gameplay to me was frustrating and didn't ever really feel right. There was no variability in the way that you could approach certain situations, so it just felt very frustrating experience. The best thing I can say about it is that it was short. I got my trophies and I got out. It was as simple as that. But I was like, within the first day of playing it, within me putting just 4 hours in the game, I was already ready for it to end. Like I didn't want to play it any further. And I did, and it wasn't worth it then. So yeah, I don't really have anything positive, unfortunately, to say about Atlas Fallen. It's been a long time since I made a review where I clearly did not like any any element of it. I don't, again, me just thinking very kind of objectively, I guess the only cool thing I can say about it is that it takes place in a world that we don't really see very often. You know, very large desert landscapes, kind of a sci-fi, but kind of fantasy-oriented aesthetic in a way. You know, there's monsters like these big giant monsters, but even the enemy designs aren't really that special. You know, there's no dynamic weather in the game, so it's not even like you're traversing the dunes and then all of a sudden like a big sandstorm comes in and it makes your gameplay much more difficult or something like that. They actually do have something like that, but it's only in certain moments in the world, and it happens repeatedly. So it's not dynamic in any way. It's not like you'll be fighting a boss and all of a sudden some type of weather storm comes in and there's lightning and it looks like that scene from Mad Max Fury Road. It doesn't look anything like that, but it could have. It could have had that cool stuff in there. They just for whatever reason, I think that there's just been a lot of issues with development for getting this out the door. I have to say Atlas Fallen is Deck 13's worst game to date. I would actually say this is even worse than Lords of the Fallen, because although this game is polished, at least on the frame rate and performance side, you can play it without issues. Yes, there are some bugs here and there, but it's nothing. It's nothing that really. I guess the only bad thing is that during the final boss, I did have the game crash and I had to actually defeat the final boss again. That was like the only, one instance, but I felt like that was the game giving me like the middle finger one last time before I finished it. It was almost intentional. Yeah, it's just, at least from start to finish, it is a relatively polished game. You can play it without any performance issues, but you're not going to really want to. There's really nothing here for, I think, anyone to really experience. I can't really recommend it for anything, because there's no story to be told here worth listening to, no interesting side missions, no interesting characters, a somewhat interesting world, but definitely not utilized in the way that it should have been, not even interesting music, and the gameplay is frustrating. So yeah, it is definitely, I think, the worst game that I played this year, but I did not play Gollum, and that game is just broken beyond repair from everything that I've heard. But as far as what I did play, this is at the bottom of the list. Really sad to say that, because again, I think Deck 13, they've been on a really decent track record as of late, making really good games, and very interesting games at least, and this one just isn't it. So skip it, ignore it. I cannot recommend it under any circumstances, I guess, unless you're a trophy or achievement hunter and you just want that. But it's really going to fight you throughout the entire experience. So let me know what you guys think if you did play the game. If you haven't, that's my thoughts. Those are my reviews. And thank you guys for watching this video. Thank you all for your patience. As I'm coming back to YouTube here, there are going to be other reviews coming out soon, so I will see you guys for those, and until then, have a good one.